Alright, what's going on everyone? So we're back here on Web Dev Daily to complete another front-end challenge, and the challenge that we have for today is going to be this sign-up form. So let's start off by clicking this, and then we can get a better preview of what the challenge actually is, and then we can just go ahead and click on Start Challenge. So one thing that was recently added to the platform was the ability to download the Figma design for the challenge. So not only can you preview the actual challenge itself in the editor, but you can now also download the Figma file to get a little bit more accurate and have a little bit easier time completing this challenge and take out the guesswork from, determining how much spacing is between here, the font size and the colors and all that. So to download the Figma file, you just want to click on the Figma button in the bottom right hand corner, and that's going to download that, and then you can just open that up in Figma. Alright, so I went ahead and got this design now open here in Figma, and we are in what is called the new developer mode within Figma, which is really handy and I really like it a lot. It just gives you a lot easier access to the elements and getting stuff like spacing, the typography, colors and all that. So definitely recommend switching to the developer mode when you're converting designs like this in Figma into code. It just makes it a whole lot easier. So the first thing that I like to do when I'm converting a design like this into code is just analyze things and get a feel for what exactly it is that we're going to need to do. Now for this sign up form, it is pretty simple and straightforward. I don't think anything's going to be really too challenging. The biggest thing we're probably going to have, or at least the most challenging thing from this component, is this section right here where we have this blurb that says or sign up with email, and then we have the border on the left and right. Everything else is pretty simple and straightforward. Okay, so back here inside of our editor, a few things that I want to do is we're going to adjust the font size to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see while watching this video. So we'll just bump it up to about 18, and then we can just drag this over to give us a little bit more room here inside of the editor. And we're not actually going to be using Talon for this challenge, so I'm just going to remove this script for Talon here. But we are going to be using the Google font, and we're also going to be using Iconify for a couple of the icons, or at least this one Google icon here. So we're going to leave those two. And then what we also want to do is remove all this boilerplate, so we can just collapse this entire div, and we can just remove that and save that, and that'll give us a clean slate. Now back here inside of Figma, what we're going to do, which is really not necessary, but it's a good practice to get into, is we're going to set up some color variables for all the colors that we're going to be using inside of this component. So you can see we have this blue, which is being used inside of this button, and it's also being used down here inside of this login text. And then we have this gray, which is also being used within the placeholders. And the last one we have is going to be this red. And then obviously we have black in a couple different spots, but we don't really need to declare that. So what we can do is let's first grab this blue color. So we'll just copy this, and then we'll head back over to the editor. And then within the CSS tab, we can just declare these inside of the root. So we'll say root like this, or not that, we'll do two O's. And then the first one we'll just do is we'll call this blue, I guess. We don't really have a distinct color for this. And then we'll just add the pound sign to this. And while we're also within our CSS tab, what we can do is a reset. So we want to set the margin to be 0. And then we want to set the padding to also be 0. And then we're going to set the box sizing to be border box. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started on the markup for this. So first off, we're going to want to create a div to wrap our form itself. So we'll just give this a class of form wrap. And then within here, we're going to have the form itself. So we'll use a form element for this, and we'll just get rid of the action there, and we can just give it a class of form. Now within our form, we're going to want to start creating our elements. So the first thing we have is going to be this header. So let's grab the content for that. We can just copy this. And then within our form element, we're going to create an H1, and we'll just paste in that copy like that. And once we save it, you're going to see we now have this content being displayed within the preview. So next we have our button. So we'll want to create a button element. And what I think we're going to need to do is, because if we look at the design, we have two buttons which have very similar styles. They just had different colors. So I think we'll want to create a generic button class that's going to set up the padding and all that sort of stuff. So what we'll do is we're just going to create a class of BTN, and then we'll probably just call this BTN blue like that to give it that different background color compared to the other one that we have. So I think that should be fine. We might come back and, alter that. So within this button though, we have an icon and then also some text. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab that icon from Iconify, but we also want to insert a span, and the content for this is just sign up with Google. So we'll copy this and we'll paste that within here. Now for that Google icon, we're going to be using my favorite icon library called Iconify, and I'll leave a link down below in the description to this. So all we want to do is type in Google, and then we can just use this one. Now we already went ahead and implemented the CDN into our editor, which we can see if we go back over here, we have this CDN for Iconify already inserted. So to use icons, all we want to do is scroll down to the icon that we selected. We want to click on HTML, and then we can use what is called this Iconify web component, where we can just copy this in, and then we can copy that to our clipboard, head back over, and then we can just paste it in within this button. And once we save it, we should now see we have that icon. Now for this section here, which I mentioned is probably going to be the most complicated part of this component, what I'm thinking we'll need to do is we'll have a 1 pixel tall line that spans across the entire form, and then we're just going to have the contents sit on top of it. And what that's going to do is it's going to give it a effect that there's a line on either side. So let's do our best to just write out some markup for that. So what we want to do is beneath our button, we'll just create a div, and we'll just give this a class of, we'll say, or break, if I can type. And then within here, we'll just create a span, and the content we want to add is going to be or sign up with email. And I think that's all we should need to go ahead and create that, but we may need to come back and add some additional markup. Now, the next thing we're going to add is going to be our inputs. So we'll create a div for this, and we're going to want to have an input container, which is going to wrap our inputs and then also this button. So on this div, we'll just give it a class of input container. Now within this input container, we're going to have a div for each one of our inputs. So for each one of these inputs, as you can see, it's going to have a label and then the input itself. So what we can do is we'll just give this a class of input wrap, and then we'll create our label, and this is going to be for the full dash name, and then within the label content we'll say full name like this, and then we'll have our input, we'll say input, and it's going to have the type of text, and then we'll add a placeholder, and then what's the placeholder content, we'll just copy this over. And then we'll also want to add an ID, so that way when we click on the label, it'll then focus you into this input, and we want to give the ID the same value as we pass for this for attribute on that label. So we'll say full name like this. So once we save that, if we now click into this input or on this label, it's going to focus us into that input. Okay. So then what we'll want to do is just duplicate this down once more for the email. So we'll change out this for attribute and ID to say email, and then for the actual value of the label, we'll say email like this. And then let's go over here and we'll copy this placeholder content, and then we'll paste it within this placeholder for the input. And then lastly, we'll change the type of this from text to email. And one other thing we can do, which is, something you want to do on forms, is when you are submitting the form, if you want to ensure that a user has value in there, what we can do is we can just add what is called the required attribute, and if there's no value, and for email specifically, if it doesn't match a format, I believe, it will go ahead and throw a validation error without you having to do anything. So this is also pretty handy to add when you're, creating your forms. And beneath this email input, we'll just create our button. And then what we're going to do is give it a type of submit, because what we want to do is when we click this button, we then want to submit the form. And I'm not sure if I've shown this or not, but on this button up here that we have for our sign up with Google, I went ahead and added the type of button. So that way, when we click on this, it's not going to submit this form. Okay. And then we'll add a few classes. So we're going to add our button class that we're going to create. And then we'll also say btn-red, and then for the content, this will say get started. And lastly, below our button, we have some text content. So what we can do is copy this, head back over, and then beneath our input container, we can just create a new paragraph tag, and we can paste that in. Now, the only thing that we're going to want to do is we do want to add a span within this paragraph tag, because we are going to want to style this login text a little bit differently from what's inside of the paragraph tag itself. Alright, so now that we have our markup, let's begin to work on the styling for this. So we can go over to the CSS tab once more, and then the first thing we can do is target our form wrap that we have. So we want to get this content into the middle of the page. So the first thing we want to do is we need to give this form wrap container a minimum height. So we'll say min height, and we'll say 100 VH, and that's going to make it take up the full space available here inside of the viewport. So to get into the center, we have a few different options. We could use Flexbox or Grid. I have recently found that using the grid approach is a little bit simpler, and it's something that more people are doing more commonly, I guess. So we can just use that approach. So we'll say display, and then we'll set this to grid. And then we want to use what is called the place items and set this to center. And that's going to push it not only vertically into the center, but also horizontally. And if we take a look at the design, as you can see, we have a background color, which we did forget to add to our variables, so we can add that as well. So we'll copy this back over in our editor. We can just call this, BG, I guess, and then we'll paste that in. We'll add the pound sign here, and then we'll put the semicolon there. And then for the background color, we'll say background color, and we can use our variable, and then we'll say our BG. And as you can see now, the background is going to be changed to that color we set here for that BG variable. So next we can target the form itself. So the first thing we'll want to do is we're going to set the background color to be white. And then if we take a look at the comp, you can see that the width should be a maximum of 517 pixels. So what we can do to actually get that or achieve that is we can say a max width of 517 pixels. And then we can set the width property to be 100%. And what this is going to do is it's going to say, hey, we want this form to be we want this to take up the full space available, but we don't want it to get larger than 517 pixels. Okay, so if we were to, resize this, it's going to get no larger than 517 pixels, but it's also going to be responsive. All right. So next, if we take a look, we have some padding within this form. So if we take a look, it looks like 60 on the top and 50 on the bottom. We'll just say 60 and 60 to keep it consistent. And then on the left and right, it looks like 90. Okay, so we'll say padding, and then we'll do 60 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 90 pixels on the left and right. And then also, I believe it looks like there's a border radius, which is about 10 pixels. So we'll do a border radius, and we'll set that to be 10 pixels. Next, we'll target the H1, so let's take a look at the comp for this. So we can see that the font size needs to be a little bit smaller at 24 pixels, and then also the font weight should be 400. So by default, I think the headers are like 700 or 600 or something like that. So we'll say font size, and we'll set this to 24 pixels, and then for the font weight, we'll set this to be 400. So it's going to be a little bit thinner. And then also we want to align this text to the center, so we'll say text align, and we'll set that to center. And for the spacing between this button and our header, you can see it says 59 pixels, but we'll just round that up to 60. So we'll say margin on the bottom of this H1, and we'll set that to be 60 pixels. All right, so next we have our buttons. So what we can do is just style out that button class that we made, which will then apply to both of these buttons that we have here. So if we just zoom in and we take a look and we see the padding, so we're not really going to worry about the padding on the left and right. Well, maybe we will for this button right here. So maybe we'll say the padding on the left will be 8 pixels because it looks like it's 7. We'll just round that up. And then on the top and bottom, if we take a look, it's 25 and 21. We'll just say 24 on the top and bottom. So what we can do is let's just add that button class. We can just do beneath our H1. So we'll say BTN, and then we'll add our padding, and we'll do 24 on the top and bottom, and then 7 pixels on the, or we'll do 8 actually, 8 on the left and right. And then what we also want to do is we're going to say width, and we want this to span across the form entirely. So we can say width be 100%, and those are now going to span. We also want to remove some of the defaults that we have. So as you can see, there's a border around it, which I don't think there is a border in the buttons here in the comps, which there isn't. So we'll remove those. So we'll just say border, and we'll set that to be none. That's going to remove that. I think there was a border radius, which was 8 pixels. So we'll say 8 pixels like that. And the last thing we're going to need to do for these buttons is adjust the font size. As you can see, it's set to be 18, so let's do that. So beneath our border radius, we'll say font size and set that to be 18 pixels. And I think that should do it for now for these buttons. What we could also do is add a nice little hover effect. So we can say BTN and target this in the hover state. So there's a few things you can do on hover to make, a button stand out a little bit more. You could, scale it to make it look like the button is popping out, or you could just, add an opacity to the button itself. So maybe we'll do both. So we can just say scale, And then what I like to do for this is go very subtle. We'll do 1.2. We'll actually say transform here. And with this added, what's going to happen is when we hover over the button, as you can see, it's going to scale just slightly, nothing crazy. And we can make this a little bit smoother if we were to add a transition. So we'll do that. And we'll say 200 milliseconds, ease and all. So now that should be a little bit smoother when we are hovering over that, which it is. And we can also add an opacity to this, and we'll just say 0.8 like that. So now the button's going to get a little bit lighter when we hover over it. And we'll see that more once we add the actual classes for our colors. So let's do that as well while we're here. So we'll say BTN, I believe we said blue. And then we want to change the background color to be our var, and then we'll do blue. And then we'll just copy this down, and then we'll say our other class we created was for BTN red, and we'll just use our variable of red. So now if we save that, we should have those changed, and the only thing we need to add actually, now that we change our colors, is going to be the font color for our button, which for both of these we can just make to white. So we'll say color, and then we'll set that to be white. So we still need to do some additional styling for this button that we have with our icon. So for this, what I think we're going to need to do is back in the HTML, we could target the BTN blue class since this is the only instance we have of this. But I think for like best practice purposes, we should, treat this as like a utility class and not actually override anything besides the background color for this. So what we can do is we'll add a third class called BTN with icon like this, and that way we can target it specifically inside of our style sheet. And we'll also need to target this icon that we have within our style sheet as well. So we'll pass it a class and we'll say Google-icon like that. So let's target this new class that we created called BTN with icon. And what I think we want to do is we want to set the display to be flex on here. And that's going to position it here on the very left-hand side, which is kind of what we want. And then what we want to do is let's take a look at the HTML. So we have that span. So I think first off, let's scroll back down and we're going to say BTN with icon, and then we'll target that span. And I think we want to have this take up the full space available and just leave room for the icon. So we can say flex 1, and that should kind of align it with what we see here in the design. And then we want to target that icon itself. So again, we can say BTN with icon and then target the class of Google-icon. And I think what we want to do is add some padding around this icon itself. So if we take a look at the comp, it looks like there's, we'll say 12 padding around all sides. So we'll say padding and we'll set that to be 12 pixels. And then I think we want to set the background color to be white. I'm not sure if that's going to work. It does. Okay. And then we want to add some border radius to that, which it looks like it's 4 pixels. So we'll say border radius and we'll do 4 pixels like that. Now, as you can see right now, the button is looking quite odd. So the first thing we can do is, since we're using a display of flex on the class now of our button, we can use a property called align items and set that to center. And that's going to push the actual text content into the center. Now, the other issue we have is because this icon now is taking up more space, it's also adding that 24 pixels of padding on the top and bottom, which is making the button appear to be a lot larger than it should be. And then also one other thing that we're going to need to do is I think the icon should also be a tad bit bigger. So you can see right now the icon is 32 pixels tall and 32 pixels wide. So what we want to do is go back over to Iconify and we can actually set the height that we want. So we'll say 32 and then 32, and then it shows us how we can add that. So it looks like we just want to add a width and height property to that icon component. So let's go back over here into our HTML, and then we can add this beside the class that we have, and you can see it's going to be a lot bigger now, which I think is going to align more with what we have inside of the design. But we also want to remove that default padding that we have within our button class. So right now the padding on the top and bottom is actually being set to 24. So we take a look at the comp, you can see that on this button specifically, it looks like the padding should be 7 pixels on the top and bottom. So let's adjust that. So on the button with icon class, we can say padding, and we'll do 8 pixels on the, actually it'll be 8 pixels all around, right? So if we save that, I think that is going to align more with what we have inside of the design. And the last thing we can do is just add some spacing between our button and this next section, which you can see is 55 pixels. So what we can do is on this button with icon class, we can add a margin on the bottom and we'll set that to be 55 pixels. Now for this section, like I mentioned, what I think we're going to need to do is create a line that spans across the entire form itself, and then we just want to align this content on the top. So let's see if we can get that to work. So what we want to do is we're going to target the class that we created. I think it was called or break like this. And then I think what we're going to want to do is we could either create an element or we can use what is called the before or after pseudo selector, I think they're called. So we can say after, and then what we want to do is we want to say content, and this is equal to an empty string. And then we're going to say, let's put a semicolon there. And then we'll do width, and this will be 100%. And we can say height would be 1 pixel. And then for the background color, let's actually check and see if that's the color we have. So it looks like it's that variable we defined for our gray. So we can say background color, and then we can use our var, and we'll say gray. And if we save that, we're actually not seeing a line. And what I think we need to do is we want to target the or break div that we have. And we want to try setting the display to be flex, and I think that should work. So once we do that, we're able to see our line. However, the orientation for a flex container by default is going to be a row. We want to set this to be a column, and once we do that, we can now see that the line is going to span across the entire form. So right now we can barely see that line. So let's go ahead and check out what the distance is between this and that. So it looks like 44 pixels. So we'll just round up and say margin on the bottom, and then we'll say 45, and there we go. So now we can see our line. So what we want to do is I think we'll want to set this line to be absolutely positioned within this div. So right beneath content, we'll try position, and we'll say absolute, and it goes outside of there. And I think the reason for that is because we then need to set a position relative on here, and now that is working, or it's, you know, confined within our form itself. And what we'll need to do is align this text to the center, and then we also want to have this line directly in the center of our text. So first off, we can align our text to the center in a couple different ways. Since we are using Flexbox, we can say align items and push all that to the center. Now to get this line in the middle, I think we can just say top, because we haven't set anything. So top 0 would be like that. So if we were to say bottom 0, I believe it's going to go to the bottom. So we can probably do, we can set top, and then we can say 50%. I think that should intersect right down the middle, which is what we want. However, you can see that it's cutting off the text, which is what we don't want. So let's target that text. So we'll say or break, and then I think it was a span. Let's just double check. Yes, it was a span. So in that span, what we want to do is first off, we want to set the text transform, and this is going to be uppercase like this. And then we want to set a background color, and what that's going to do is it's going to cut off that line and essentially make it look like there is like a border on the left and the right. So since our background is white for the form, we can just say white like that, and that didn't seem to actually do what I thought. So let me try adding some padding on here. Maybe we'll say on the left and right we'll do like 4 pixels, 0 and 4, which still doesn't seem to work. So the reason why I think this isn't working is because on this after selector, we have it set to be position absolute. So I think all we want to do is set a z index, and we want to set it to something like 1 or higher than 0. And then you can see it's going to now be over the top of that line. So we can make the padding on the left and right a little bit larger to mimic the design more. As you can see, there's a little bit more space there. So let's try something like 8, and that doesn't seem to work. Maybe we need to set this to be display block like that. I think that's actually the reason, because I think by default spans are inline blocks, so I don't think they actually take in padding if I'm not mistaken. So let's try maybe a little bit larger, 12. Let's see what the spacing between here is, 15. So we'll just add that to be 15 on both sides, and there we go. I think that is pretty close. Now obviously we want to also update the font color for this, so we're going to say color, and this is going to be our var, and we have that gray like that, and I think that is pretty close. And one final thing is we just want to adjust the font size to be 14 pixels. Alright, so next we have our inputs. So inside of our HTML file, I believe we encapsulated these inside of a class called input container, and then our inputs both have a class of input wrap. So let's start off by targeting our input container. And what we'll do is we'll start off by setting the display to be flex, and then we're going to set the flex direction to be a column. And the reason why we're going to do this is because if you take a look at all the items that we have encapsulated within this input container, we have this input, and this button. As you can see, the spacing between these two items, or I guess these three, is all 25 pixels. So what we can do using Flexbox is once we have, our display set to flex and our flex direction set to column, we can use a property called gap and set this to be 25 pixels. And what this is going to do is it's going to add 25 pixels in between each one of these flex children. So next we're going to target these input wraps that we have, which contain the label and the input. So we'll say input wrap, and then what we want to do is we'll set these to also have a display of flex, and then we want to set the flex direction to be a column, column. And then what we also want to do is I think there is a slight gap between these two. So we look at the label and then the input, there's 4 pixels, and the label by default is 16, so we don't need to worry about changing the font size there. And then the input also has 16 font size as well, so we don't need to do anything with that. So what we can do on our input wrap is, again, we can use the gap property and we can set this to be 4 pixels. Now for the inputs themselves, we have a padding on the top and bottom of 25, and then we have a padding on the left and right of 22. So back inside of our style sheet, let's scroll back up and we'll say input wrap, and then we'll target our input itself. And then what we want to do is apply some padding, which is going to be 25 on the top and bottom, and then 22 on the left and right. And I believe that font size by default for inputs aren't actually 16 pixels. They may be 14 or 15, so we want to update the font size to be 16 pixels. And then I think there's also a different border color and also a border radius. So we have a border radius of 5, and then we have this border here. So I know we didn't add this color to our variables, but since it's only being used for the border, I'm not going to go ahead and add that. But you could if you wanted to, so I'll paste that in like that. And then we also have a border radius of 5 pixels. Alright, so the last thing we need to style is going to be this text content here. So the first thing we want to do is just get the spacing between our button and our text content, which is going to be 55 pixels. So right beneath our input wrap of input, we can just target our paragraph tag. Now we're targeting it this way because we only have one paragraph tag within this component, but obviously be careful. If you have more than one paragraph tag, then this is going to apply to all of them. But in this scenario, we can do that because we only have this one. So first off, we'll set our margin on the top to be 55 pixels, and that'll push it down. Now we also want to align this text to the center, so we'll say text align and we'll push that to the center. And then the last thing we want to do is, if you check the comp, you can see that we have this login part of the text that is a different color, which is the color of our button. So if you recall, we did put that inside of a span within this paragraph tag. So what we want to do is target that paragraph tag and then our span, and we can say color, and we can use our variable of blue, and now that's going to be blue. Okay. And what we could also probably do is when we hover over this part of the text, we could also change that to be a cursor of pointer. So we'll say cursor pointer like that. And now when we hover over that, we're going to have this cursor pointer. And we could probably also add this for the buttons as well. So let's copy this. And then on our button class, we can just add this as well. And now when we hover over the button, you can see we're going to have that cursor pointer. Alright, so the last thing we're going to do is add some JavaScript to add some interactivity to this component. So what we're going to do is when we click on Get Started, we're going to capture the values from both of these inputs, and then we're going to alert it here within the browser. So we want to declare a few variables to do this. So the first one we want to do, or we want to capture, is going to be our form. So we'll create a variable called form, and then we'll set this equal to a document.querySelector. And then we'll just say .form. And I don't think we gave the inputs a class, so we could also target these by the type of text and the type of email, but to keep things a little bit more simple, what we can just do is we'll add a class to these, and then we'll just say first name, and then we'll say class email. And then we can create variables for these. So we'll say first name is equal to a document.query selector, and then we'll say first dash name, and we can just copy this down, and we'll say email, and then we'll do email like this. And the first thing you want to do is you want to add a event listener to our form, and what we want to listen for is going to be the submit events. And how this works is whenever we click on this button of get started, because within the HTML on this button we have a type of submit, that's going to fire that submit event, and we can listen for this on the form, and then we can perform some logic or do what we want after we hear that event within this callback function. So what we also want to do is pass along the event parameters. So by default, whenever we fire the submit event, the default action for a form is to refresh the page. So we don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to call our event parameter, and we're going to call something called the prevent default method, and this will prevent the default from happening when submitting this form. Now what we're going to do in our example is we're just going to alert out a message with the user's first name and email. So how we can do this is we can use some template interpolation by doing some backticks, and we can say thank you, and then we can use our first name. So we can say first name like this, and I think we just want to do dot value for submitting. Okay, so I went ahead and typed that message out. So what we're going to do is we're going to output the first name dot value, which is this input right here, and then we'll also output the email, which is this input right here, using email dot value, which we're storing inside of these two variables. So now if we come down here and just say John Komarnicki like this, and then we do john@.com, and we click on get started. Within the alert message, you're now going to see the full. And the last thing we'll do, which is always a good idea, is to clear the form values after you submit it. So what we can say is first name dot value is equal to an empty string, and we can do the same thing for our email. So now when we submit this, what should happen is those values should be cleared back to be an empty string. So we click on get started, and we click OK. And that didn't seem to work. Oh, we didn't save it. So now we save it and we say John, and we'll just do John at, and we click on get started. You can see we're going to have those values still being outputted inside of the alert message. And once we click OK, those are going to be cleared. All right, so I think that's going to wrap it up here for this challenge. The last thing I want to test out is going to be the responsiveness, which as you can see looks pretty good. The one thing that we could probably fix really quick is once the form gets to a small enough size, you can see that it buds up against the left and the right, which we obviously don't want. So to fix that, what we could do is on the form wrap, we could add some padding around all the sides. So we'll just say 16 pixels like that. And yeah, that looks a lot better. Okay, so now that we're all done with our challenge, the last thing that we want to do is publish it. So to do that, we can click on the publish button here in the top right hand corner. And once that is done, we're going to get a pop-up confirming that our challenge was published. And if you wanted to, you can share it on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook, or you can just copy the link. And from here, what you can do is you can view more challenges, or you can go to your profile. And once you get to their profile, you're going to see here that we have the recently submitted sign-up form. And if you want to view or edit your challenge, all you want to do is click on it, which is going to take you to this preview of what your challenge looks like. And if you want to make any changes, you can just click on edit, and then you can make any changes within here, and then you can save those, and then your challenge is going to be updated. And also recently added to the platform was this latest solutions page, which you can find by clicking on the solutions tab here in the navigation. And this has all the latest solutions from challenges here on Web Dev Daily. So if we scroll down, we can see we have a challenge from Benjamin, which is the email verification challenge. So if we select on this, we're going to see a preview of that challenge itself. And if you wanted to get a look at how he created it, you can now also view the code for this challenge by clicking on the code button here in the top right hand corner. And I definitely think this is a very useful feature because you can learn a lot by reviewing other people's code. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you guys did enjoy it. If you did, be sure to leave a like on it down below and subscribe if you are new for more content like this. And be sure to head over to Web Dev Daily and sign up for your free account. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.